What's good, everybody? It's the Clown with Cab Show. Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul, August 5th. I can't wait till this fight, but I just thought this fight would be a lot more bigger than really what it is. I feel like a lot of people aren't really talking about it, to whereas last year, everybody was talking about this. Oh, this is going to be a huge mega fight. And then Jake Paul goes to fight Tommy Fury. He gets dusted by Tommy Fury, and it's just like, hey, do the YouTuber cats really have a chance against these real life, real trained boxers? And the answer is no. I don't think so. I mean, it is good for boxing, a dying sport that I don't see really a sport growing. I mean, can we name 5 superstars in boxing right now that are like box office besides Canelo and Tank Davis? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, let's be honest here. I just think boxing in a way has definitely drifted down, to where it used to be with like Mike Tyson, Muhammad Ali, the greats, George Foreman, all the greats that fought before us. It's just not the same anymore. It's just not. But I mean, Nate Diaz, he's not obviously a boxer. He's a UFC cat. I mean, this is a different sport, completely different, even though Nate Diaz does have hands. I mean, we seen him in the Leon Edwards fight at the end of the 5 rounds with a minute to go. We saw him touch up Leon Edwards, who is the champion right now at 170, which is crazy, right? But Nate Diaz, he's got hands and he's got cardio. And that's the thing you need in boxing. I mean, you don't need to be a top level pro to fight Jake Paul. I mean, dude, Jake Paul was fighting tomato cans. Like, he was fighting Ben Askren, dude. Like, Ben Askren is a UFC wrestler, dude. He is not a boxer whatsoever. Ben Askren got knocked out, got embarrassed, but probably got over $500,000 to get knocked out and to get embarrassed. You know what I'm saying? So, like, for Jake Paul, that wasn't really credible win over Ben Askren or Nate Robinson, a former NBA player. Like, once he finally fought a real fighter, a real boxer, we saw Tommy Fury really touch him up, even though Jake Paul did take some rounds off Tommy Fury, which, Tommy Fury's not a top-level boxer either, dude. I mean, he thinks he's his brother, who's the heavyweight champion of the world, Tyson Fury, but there's levels to this. There's a huge difference, and we're looking at Tommy Fury here and realizing, hey, he's not really a superstar. He doesn't draw the numbers like Canelo does. He just doesn't. I mean, but Jake Paul, he's 6-1 in boxing. He's 4 by knockout, which is good. He's young and hungry, which I do think he should win this fight against Nate Diaz. We're talking boxing here. Now, obviously, if this was MMA or a street fight, 100% Nate Diaz. All day, every day. I'm going Nate no matter what in a street fight or in the UFC against Jake Paul. I mean, we have to realize that, but this is boxing. It's more technical, and I do think Jake Paul, even though I do think he needs to work on some of his angles, the way he throws shots, I just feel like he comes too dependent on his overhand right. If I'm Jake Paul's trainer, I'm saying, hey, let's practice more of the jabs. Let's practice more footwork. Let's practice more just the basic skill 101s of just movements inside the ring, dude. I just feel like Jake Paul's not really on that yet, which he can be. He's really relatively fresh in boxing, but I want to call Jake Paul a top-tier boxer. If Jake Paul goes to fight, after I believe he should beat Nate Diaz in a boxing match, if he beats Nate Diaz, let's say he does fight Canelo, dude, there's no way. There is no way Jake Paul wins, maybe even 1 round against Canelo. Canelo's just a different breed, and I just think, right now Jake Paul's becoming one-dimensional on his overhand right. It's just like, dude, if you want to really go deep in the sport of boxing, it's like you got to do different stuff. You just have to, man. I just think some of the stuff that he's doing is kind of just uncoordinated in a way, and it's just unorthodox, but I think that could really prepare him for better. But we have to understand Nate Diaz, he's 22-13 in the UFC, in his career in the UFC. I don't necessarily think it's done yet. I do think he's got 1 or 2 more fights left in the UFC. I mean, great business for Dana White in the UFC. Why not? Why not sign Nate Diaz for 1 more fight against maybe a trilogy with McGregor? I mean, put on some huge fights. UFC 196 against McGregor, I believe it was. And he upset McGregor. He was a huge underdog in that fight. I remember that fight. McGregor got choked out in the 2nd round. But what led him up to that was his hands, was Nate Diaz's combinations. I'm telling you, if Jake Paul comes into this fight really underestimating Nate Diaz, it's going to be a long night for Jake Paul because he does have hands. Nate Diaz has great hands. That's so underrated. We saw that in the McGregor, the first fight against McGregor. Then the second fight was really a really close fight, even though McGregor did win by decision in that fight. I mean, he's put on some huge fights. Jorge Masvidal, even though he did get torched up, I think it was a doctor stoppage in the 4th round due to a cut on Nate Diaz. But that was a big fight as well. The Leon Edwards fight, the fight that really he was getting dominated the whole fight except the last minute where Nate Diaz decided he wanted to showboat and point to him and just do all types of silly stuff, right? But if you're really Nate Diaz, you're thinking, hey, I'm going to charge against Leon when he's hurt and wobbling backwards, where you probably lost all 4 rounds up into this moment. Like, if I'm Nate Diaz, I'm going to charge at him. I'm going to, like, just jump on him, maybe even try to submit him. We know Nate Diaz is great at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, something like that, but Nate Diaz is for the fans. He fights for the fans, and that's how he's put on some huge fights for the UFC and Dana White, where it's just like, holy cow, Nate Diaz is in another huge UFC fight, dude. It's been like that, relatively, even when he was young. I mean, back when he won the Ultimate Fighter on the UFC was back in 2007, and Nate Diaz was fighting way before 2007. So really, Nate Diaz has been in the game over 2 decades, dude. He's put over 20 years in the fight game. Easy. Maybe even 30. Probably 30 overall. I would say 30. Most of his life, Nate Diaz has been fighting, dude, and it's been amazing. But, looking at Nate Diaz, his most recent win is against Tony Ferguson, which he is washed up. He ended up choking Tony Ferguson out, but that's not relatively a great win for Nate Diaz overall. But he does great business for the UFC. He sells great fights, and that's why Dana White likes Nate Diaz, because he makes him a lot of money, and he's the people's fans' favorite. Everybody loves Nate Diaz. Everybody wants to see a guy like Nate Diaz in a street fight, dude, where he's a goon, he's not scared of anything, he doesn't fear no man. That is Nate Diaz to a T, and he does not give a F. He likes to smoke on his, just out in public. He likes to smoke on press conferences before fights. I think that's why a lot of people love Nate Diaz, because he just doesn't give a F. He doesn't care about people's opinions, and really, Nate Diaz is a true fighter. He's a bona fide hustler. He's a triple OG in my book, and look at Nate Diaz, his experience all the way up until this moment, dude. He's been fighting his whole life. So I love Nate Diaz. I think it's going to be a really interesting fight against Jake Paul, the hungry young fighter right now, up and coming. I do think Jake Paul should win this fight by decision. I don't think Jake Paul's going to knock Nate Diaz out. Never in a million years. That's definitely not going to happen. Now, if Nate Diaz is going to win this fight, it's going to be by volume and cardio and just pressing this fight. I believe it's a 10-round bout, even though back in the old days they did 15 rounds in boxing, but it's probably 10 rounds. So I just think for Nate, it's just push it. Push it. It's only a 10-round fight, dude. And Nate Diaz is used to UFC getting kicked everywhere in the legs. So Nate Diaz, it's going to be a little bit different feel of just throwing hands. But at the same time, it's like, Nate Diaz wasn't really the karate type of guy anyway. Nate Diaz loves to throw hands in the UFC. He would knock a lot of guys out in the UFC through his hands. So I think this is going to be an interesting fight, and I don't think Jake Paul's going to blow him out of the water. Heck no. I just think it would be so much different. Now, let's say if this was in the UFC, I'm going Nate all day, dude, because Nate could take you down if he wanted, or he could do so many different things to Jake Paul, right? Even though Jake Paul is the bigger guy, weighs much more than Nate Diaz. I think they're fighting this fight at, 175, maybe 180, somewhere around there, probably 180. But I just think Nate Diaz, he's tall. He's a little bit taller than Jake Paul, so I think he can use his range, his reach a little bit more, and just use his experience. That's what Nate Diaz has to do in this fight. Use his cardio, use your experience, and use everything you build up into this moment against Jake Paul. We're talking about a guy who was on Disney at one point when Nate Diaz was street fighting, dude. Nate Diaz was putting on street fights and UFC fights while Jake Paul was in Disney at one point. Now all of a sudden the tides have turned. Now they're going in a boxing ring where, it's going to be a little bit different officiating, kind of like the McGregor-Mayweather fight. That was completely different, and a lot of UFC fans were picking, McGregor to win, which I thought, could have been, but at the end of the day, we're talking about Mayweather here. He's never lost in boxing, so I took the smart way, saying, no, Mayweather's going to win, probably by decision, even though Mayweather won by knockout in the, 10th round against McGregor. It was just a different feel, but McGregor really played it great the first 5 rounds, until you get gassed out. That's his weakness, but for Nate Diaz, his strengths are definitely his cardio. So, later on the rounds, if Jake Paul is getting tired in the 6th, 7th round, I'm definitely going to edge Nate Diaz here. That just same thing in the UFC. Nate Diaz would always start off slow, typically, in a lot of his fights. Same thing with the McGregor fight in the first one at UFC 196. The first round was all Conor McGregor. He just touched him up. Nate Diaz just did not look good. Come second round, it was just caught the second wind, and Nate Diaz just came out firing. tag McGregor up, then eventually tap them. But, that's what Nate Diaz does. He comes out later in the rounds when the opponent is a little fatigued, and he pounces on that. He can sense that. He knows when you're going to get tired. He can sense that, and he just bounces on it. And that's why I love Nate Diaz. He can pick up on some things. So I don't think this is going to be a blowout victory by Jake Paul. I am leaning more towards Jake Paul. He's younger. He's more hungry right now. This is a sport he wants to do for his career. So it makes sense why he should win in boxing here. But we're talking about Nate Diaz, though, dude. He's a true dog. He's an OG, dude, and I'm telling you, he's a goon. So I think if Nate Diaz wins this fight, it's going to be by experience in the late rounds, and he's going to tag, Jake Paul up and eventually maybe even knock Jake Paul out, which sounds pretty crazy, right? Because Nate Diaz doesn't have all that power, right? But I'm telling you, he's got speed and timing and precision. That adds up to something spectacular. It does add up to knockouts sometimes. So I think, Nate Diaz could very well knock Jake Paul out. Now, on the flip side, same thing. Jake Paul can knock, Nate Diaz out with his overhand right, just like any boxer could with their overhand right. But at the end of the day, I think Nate Diaz is going to come very prepared into this fight. He's always preparing on his feet anyway. So I think in this fight, it's like you got to prepare for his overhand right. That's what Jake Paul likes to throw. He likes to set it up sometimes using the jab, his left jab, and then sets up the right. So I think Nate Diaz is going to come prepared. I think this is going to be a great fight. Now, is it going to sell, millions and millions of pay-per-views? Probably not. A lot of people aren't really talking about it. A lot of people didn't even know it was August 5th, the Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz fight. They just didn't, dude. I just think really, it's not really broadcasted as much as I thought it would. Around this time last year, I thought, hey, this is going to be the biggest fight all summer. It's going to be bigger than the Jake Paul and Tommy Fury that did. So I just think overall, man, I'm leaning more towards Jake Paul with the victory. But overall, I think the fans, Nate Diaz is gonna win the boxing fans over Jake Paul in this matchup. I cannot wait. We're about a month and a half away, baby. It's the Cloudwood Cab Show. Let's go!